there's an idea in philosophy that's dominated philosophy for the last few hundred years, which is called idealism, which means that reality only happens in the human mind. So my computer mouse doesn't really exist in reality, it only exists in my mind, because if I can't perceive it, then I can't know that it's real. And that's where you get people like Rene Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am. I mean, he's being actually rather literal, that if something doesn't show up in the human mind, it doesn't exist. And that position of idealism dominated philosophy and therefore architecture for a couple hundred years. And only in the last 15 years have we seen that change. So on one side, idealism, reality only exists as an idea in the mind. On the opposite side of that is realism, where objects exist in the world independently of whether the human mind perceives it or not. So in philosophy we have these two positions, idealism, realism. And realism was introduced as speculative realism around 2008 by philosophers like Timothy Morton and Graham Harman and Ray Brassier and Jane Bennett and a number of others. But they're really challenging 200 years of philosophy by saying, no, wait a minute, like what if we accept the position that objects exist independent of the human mind? What if we stop making the human so important? What if we imagine everything is equal and the human isn't the center of reality? This human is just a part of reality amongst many, many, many other objects, some of who perceive, like my dog, some of whom don't perceive, like my mouse, or I don't know if my iPhone is perceiving right now, it's recording, so maybe it's perceiving. And what that did in philosophy is it really shook things up and allowed us to think in different ways. And what that did in architecture is it allowed us to shift things up and think in different ways. So when I'm in a space, the way architecture has wanted you to experience space in the past is that you're in a space and you see the concept of the architect, right? So let's say down the street is Santiago Calatrava's transit station, like that. So he has this idea that it's supposed to look like a dove being released from the hands of a child. So you're supposed to see a bird, right? And when you're in the space, like you look up and you kind of imagine you're in the bird, it's got bones and stuff. But the idea in architecture is that you're supposed to experience what the architect wanted as their concept. So you're supposed to be able to go into a building and say, oh, this architect was interested in Kafka and deconstructed Kafka to make these different rooms these different ways, which of course never happens. But that idea of architecture being experienced as a concept never worked for me, although it's dominated architecture for the last 100 years. So if you think of modernism, you're supposed to walk into let's say Mises New Gallery, right, in Berlin. You walk in and it's a completely open space. It's open because there's kind of an idea about democracy and equality and transparency between the inside and outside, that nothing is being hidden, that everything is open to the truth. And you're supposed to walk in and understand that as a perceiver, the concept behind this vast empty space. In my experience, that never happens. So my mom walks into the New Gallery in Berlin and is like, this is boring, because it doesn't have any features and she doesn't experience the concept. So my push in architecture in the last really 20 years, 15 years, is to really look at challenging that divide between idealism, where you experience architecture as concepts, to realism, where you experience architecture through aesthetics. And in idealism, you can't have aesthetics because you don't sense anything. It's all reality is in the mind. In realism, you need aesthetics because that's how humans sense whether something is real or not. So I know this mug that has Dolly Parton on it is real because I can feel its weight, I can smell the coffee in it, I can see it, it's warm. There's a lot of sensory properties, and aesthetics is the discourse of the relationship between you and reality and how you understand reality. So people generally think aesthetics is about something being beautiful or not. That's not how aesthetics operates today. Aesthetics is about how you understand your reality through sensory information and some conceptual information. So when I go into a space, as a long answer to your question, I experience it aesthetically, which means I don't look for concepts. I look for details and colors, and I particularly enjoy being in spaces where I don't quite understand why something is the way it is, and it makes me want to perceive it more, when it generates curiosity. So if I go into the Santiago Calatrava Transit Center and I say, someone tells me it's a bird, and I'm like, oh yeah, it looks kind of like a bird, it just shuts down your curiosity. The human mind doesn't want to know anymore. But if I go into a space that I really can't understand why it is the way it is, it makes me want to look at it more. It makes me want to look closer at the details. It makes me want to be more curious about it. It raises my sensitivity to reality. So I enjoy being in spaces that invoke curiosity, that don't have a top-down concept, but are designed in such a way that invite you to have an aesthetic experience. And everyone's aesthetic experience can be different. So the architect can't really say, I'm designing this to have a specific aesthetic experience. The architect can say, I'm designing this because I'd like to produce this aesthetic experience, but people may understand that experience in different ways, right? So it takes a little bit of humility from the architect, that the architect can't say, this building is a bird, and everyone has to listen. Yeah. The architect can offer things with which people can be curious and invite a kind of dialogue between the viewers and the architect. So those are the spaces I like being in, spaces that invoke a kind of curiosity, and for that almost always involves having different aspects of architecture at different levels of detail.